Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today I have invited Chinmayi Sharma as my guest speaker. She is currently an associate professor at Fordham Law School. She has published many online and scholarly articles for AI, cybersecurity, as well as law. Thank you so much to Professor Sharma for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor.
Could you introduce yourself and your work a little bit more?
Sure. My name's Chinmayi Sharma. I'm currently a associate professor at Fordham Law School. I teach internet law and torts. My work in the legal field has spanned cybersecurity to platform governance and interoperability to now artificial intelligence. I think that a lot of academics are um, refocusing their research agenda on artificial intelligence because there's just an endless number of questions that need to be answered. Before I was a law professor, I was a practicing attorney for some time. And before law school, I was actually an iOS developer, which is what sparked my interest in tech law generally. Kind of seeing it from the developer side showed me just how irresponsible the industry can be. And so I thought that I would go to the other side and be involved in crafting the rules that prevented this sort of irresponsible things that I saw while I was at a startup.
I see. That's interesting. Is there anything that you are currently researching or you're currently just looking across that you think would be interesting and you could share with us?
Sure. A couple research projects I'm working on right now. In March in the United States, the Biden administration released the National Cyber Plan or the National Cyber Strategy. And in it, they said that there was a misalignment of incentives between software manufacturers and the public. So software manufacturers were not investing enough resources into making secure software. And what that was resulting in is a large amount of breaches and loss of personal information. And I actually wrote about this for my a scholarly paper that came out in the North Carolina Law Review last year on open source. And essentially, what I write about there is open source, which is code that is freely available for anyone to use or modify for any purpose, is something that's at the foundation of all of the technology we rely on. But it's something that is built by communities of developers that don't have the resources to hire security engineers that can make their project more secure. And so in my paper, I argue actually the companies that are using this free source code should be responsible for making that source code more secure. So if I am a major tech company and want to use a particular open source Python library, I should be the one that's looking over that code, seeing if there's any issues in it and fixing those issues before I use it in my product. And the Biden administration kind of had a similar approach. And so they're calling for they're calling for academics and policymakers and civil society to provide proposals on how would we hold companies liable under a legal regime for insecure software. And so one of the projects I'm working on right now is what sort of lessons can we learn from products liability, which is a form of tort law, which is how we basically sue a car manufacturer for selling us a defective car. How can we use that kind of a legal doctrine to hold a software manufacturer accountable for selling us defective software or insecure software? So that's one project. And then another project I'm working on is on artificial intelligence governance. There's a lot of proposals out right now on different ways that we can try to make the way artificial intelligence is developed safer and make sure it is built responsibly with ethics and privacy in mind. My proposal, I'm writing right now into a longer paper, and should have a lawfare piece that comes out later today, actually, a shorter version of it, calls for putting the onus of responsibility on engineers themselves. So that would mean as an engineer, I would need to get a license and follow some sort of practice guidelines set by the industry. Otherwise, if I don't, I would lose my license. And this is kind of a regime that we see in the US with doctors, lawyers, and architects and accountants. And we call it malpractice generally. And I think that that's a really effective way for a profession to regulate itself and have actual kind of teeth, like a punitive measures that they can take against somebody that is an irresponsible professional. So those are my two big research projects right now. And sorry to have rambled on about them for quite a while.
No, they're actually very interesting. And it's great that you mentioned the paper you published about open source, because I was just going to ask you a question about that. I believe I watched the presentation you gave to the Center for Cybersecurity Research. And actually, I'm just curious, how did you come across this topic, and what do you think the importance of, informing the public about this topic is?
I came across, so I think a lot of academics write papers when they read something or hear something or see something that frustrates them. And so coming out of the Log4Shell incident, which for those who are not familiar, kind of just a brief summary is in December 2021, a security researcher from China discovered that there was a vulnerability in an Apache library called Log4j. And this vulnerability meant that anyone who exploited it would be able to essentially take over an entire system, accessing all of the data, accessing all the devices that system is connected to. It's an extremely critical vulnerability. And because this vulnerability was found in an open source piece of software, Apache's software libraries are open source, it was something that a vast number of entities was using in their proprietary software. And so Google and Meta and Apple, they were on the US government and the Costa Rican government. There were numerous entities that all were vulnerable because they used this open source software that had this vulnerability. And coming out of this, revelation of the vulnerability, the takeaway that it seemed like people on the Hill that I was speaking to or in academia that I was speaking to had was open source is insecure, and this is the fault of the open source developers that this vulnerability even existed, and so they should be liable for it. And I thought that that was an incredibly asinine statement because open source is something, the Apache libraries in particular are built by volunteer developers. So these are people who are doing this on their free time. They're providing it for free. And essentially what they're doing is they're putting it somewhere online and saying, hey, if you want to download this, you can download this. But when it's online, it's not impacting anybody. Nobody's actually using it. But it takes a company to take it offline, put it in a product that an actual member of the public is using. And that's where the risk is introduced. The people from Apache, they didn't expose the public to this risk. They just put code available like, hey, if this is useful to you, use it. It's companies that use that code in products, but didn't check it that should be responsible for it. And so my thought was, why are we putting the responsibility on volunteer developers that don't have enough resources and are giving this, extremely valuable resource away for free? We should instead put the responsibility on the companies that are profiting from using it, because they not only have, I think, a sort of moral responsibility to do this. If they're using something for free, they should contribute back a little bit, but also they have the resources to do it. If they're profiting from this, reinvest some of those resources into checking, hey, is this free code that I'm using secure? And if it's not secure, can I fix it? And then can I notify the people that I got it from, hey, I found this issue, maybe you should fix it in your version so that future people that download it don't have this issue. That would be an ideal circumstance of people kind of paying it forward or paying it back when they're using open source code.
I see. That's quite interesting. And from what I understand, your research into this topic, it's rather groundbreaking. And do you think the government or academia had the right kind of reaction to this news? Do you think they could have done more, or do you think more research could have been performed on this topic?
I think there's a lot more research that could be performed on open source code. It's like many things that we get for free, we often take it for granted. And so It is something that is propping up the entire digital ecosystem we have, but not a lot of people understand that or see that it is there. And so, um, the government could be doing a lot more to, one, provide resources to the open source community so that they have the funding to hire a security researcher. So yes, sure, some people are willing to dedicate their time, their free time, to building these things, but maybe there's no security researcher that's willing to dedicate their time for free. So great, we can hire one because we know that this is a really important project, but you need resources to do that. Another thing that the government could be doing is involving the open source community in information sharing. So in the cybersecurity context, the government often interacts directly with the private sector of, these are threats that we are seeing on the landscape. This is how that impacts your industry or your specific company. And here's how we might be able to work together, but nobody involved kind of representatives from Linux or Apache, which are massive open source projects, in these conversations. So instead of just inviting the commercial entities, we should also be inviting open source entities to the table so that they also have the information about what are the risks out there, where are they seeing the attacks, so that they can also provide the government with information about what they need, why they're building things in certain ways. Just open up the channels for dialogue.
And I really do agree with that, because I think as we move into age of AI, we definitely need to be endorsing more collaborations between all the different fields, especially when it comes to regulating AI. Actually, on the topic of AI, I kind of want to move into this article that you published a few weeks ago on Lawfare. You talked about the company OpenAI's current situation, what with firing Sam Altman and then rehiring him. I think it provokes a lot of concern about artificial intelligence. So could you just tell us a little more about how you view this topic?
I think that, it was a subject that, as we were writing the article, which we started kind of as soon as he was originally fired, new information was coming out every hour of every day, up until when we published it. The day before was when he was rehired. And so we were making changes until the last minute. So since that article was published to now, there have been more changes, but those are happening kind of more behind closed doors, because this isn't quite in the forefront of the news cycle anymore. But essentially, I think our takeaway from that development is, so far there has been some comfort, it seems, that the public and the government has gotten from people like Sam Altman voluntarily going before Congress and saying, regulate us. We want to be regulated because we want to be responsible. We care about being cautious. We care about the public interest. We know that this is dangerous technology. And so the thought was, well, people who are building this really important technology do understand that it's risky. And so while we figure out the laws that we want, they're still going to be pursuing artificial intelligence development in a safe and responsible way. And I think that what this entire kind of the chaotic situation that was shows us is that once commercial interests have been introduced into the equation, there is no room anymore for that kind of cautious approach, because caution introduces delay and commercialization requires having a competitive advantage, and so pushing things forward. And the narrative is that Sam Altman was someone who wanted to see progress towards artificial general intelligence, or AI systems that mimic human sentience and human, basically kind of pass the Turing test and can mimic human behavior fully, not just kind of in the context of a chat bot or creating images, but the full totality of capabilities that we have, with the computing power of a machine. And so he didn't want to see that progress slowed. He was what people called an accelerationist. And the board seemed concerned about that. One of the board members had written a paper about why she thought that was irresponsible. And she talked about how OpenAI's competitor, Anthropic, was actually a more responsible approach to AI development. And in doing that, she kind of created some internal tension at OpenAI. And so Sam Altman was unhappy with this board member. The board was clearly unhappy with Sam Altman. But what ultimately happened is that the board did what the board has the power to do, which is vote him out. But as soon as he was out, and this is something the board should have foreseen, Microsoft hired him immediately. And if what the board is concerned about is this CEO is going to, guns a-blazing, push ahead till we have AGI in an irresponsible way, an even bigger fear should be, well, now this person doesn't even have the oversight of the board and is going to go to a company like Microsoft that has absolutely no interest in cautious research, is definitively a profit-driven company, and will give him an infinite amount of resources to pursue this goal. And so that's even riskier for people who are concerned about safe AI. And so all of that is to say, walking away from this, we can't trust that this industry of companies that are developing or moving towards the development of AGI will behave responsibly. This just shows us that even one of the companies that self-profess to be cautious is actually just in the rat race as much as everyone else is.
I see.
So if we want to slow it down, we need to kind of do it from a top-down government perspective.
Yes, I was actually hoping you could elaborate a bit more about the role of the government and law in this situation.
So that's, still very much, it seems to be a work in progress. We don't know what form we want to take. We want AI regulation to take. The EU actually just last week passed the EU's AI Act. That is a very meaty piece of substantive legislation, but as with the White House's executive order, it's focused primarily on highly capable, high-risk models. And so those are models that are kind of next generation models that have not come out yet, but are likely to come out next year. But what that misses is a lot of these less powerful, but still broadly impactful models. So if what we're balancing is kind of like a menu of different risks, what these legislations are getting at is like kind of like the existential threat of extremely powerful AI. So this concern of AGI, and as we move closer to AGI. But what I think is still risky and maybe missing in these conversations is, but what about the AI that might not be that powerful, but is, embedded in, Microsoft Word or email, and is behaving in ways that might seem very straightforward and simple, but could have some very serious long-term or broad effects on society. That's kind of a subset of the technology that still presents risks, but is not the highest priority for regulators right now.
I see. And I do think it's something that definitely all governments need to focus on in the future. Not just the EU, not just America. I feel like a lot of the governments who are currently banning AI should be focused on how to integrate AI into a community safely.
Yeah, I don't know that banning AI is going to. I don't know that banning technology generally has ever been really a successful route. We might say that from like a weapons context, nuclear weapons have been heavily controlled. I think that foreign policy people will tell you that even nuclear disarmament has had its own limitations with people building unsanctioned weapons. And there's like the massive barrier of the ingredients you need are extremely hard to get. But as every day passes in the AI context, building out GPTs is cheaper than ever. Like it's only going to get cheaper as the technology progressive, as the hardware kind of keeps up with in terms of like what it can provide. So it doesn't have those natural barriers to entry. So any jurisdiction I think that tries to ban this kind of technology will see it crop up in, illegal ways because there's just such high demand for it. And not wrongly so. I mean, this technology can benefit people substantially. I mean, it has risks, but it's hard to imagine and it's not actually hard to imagine because this has happened where, different geographic locations have tried to shut off internet access, but you know, people will find a way to gain it because it's just such a necessity to our life.
Yes, definitely. That was a great analysis. Let's talk a bit more about your experience as a lawyer and researcher. So I'm just curious, what would you say made you become who you are today, and what was that journey like?
Um, wow, it's a deep question. I think that from a young age, I very much enjoyed reading and talking. And, people joke, but I did always hear from an early age that, I was well suited to be a lawyer. I also joke with my parents about this, but my parents are both very logical people. And so throughout my childhood, if I wanted to buy, a toy at an amusement park or wanted to have a family dog, they would say, well, list out the reasons why we should say yes to you. And so I had to like make an argument and anticipate their, counterpoints and respond to those. And so I think that they trained me from an early stage to kind of be a lawyer in that way. But really, I really like words and I really like seeing how words can either have the intended effect or an unintended effect and why that's the case. And I think words are very powerful tools to influencing human behavior. And I think that human behavior needs to be influenced because um, the status quo, for example, I don't have a lot of sympathy for major companies, but to the extent that I do, in the market, they have certain goals that we have as a society laid out. And so we can't fault them for pushing to those goals as much as they can. So we need to introduce something else that can shift the incentive structure and influence their behavior in a different way. Otherwise, they're just doing what's natural and what's optimal in the system that we've developed. And so I think that's where kind of words and laws and policies can have a huge effect. But I also think that words and laws and policies can also have a big cultural effect. The way that we talk about certain things, the way we raise certain issues, the way we frame certain issues can impact how, for example, people like my parents or friends who don't particularly follow tech news to the degree that I do, how they think about these issues, what they care about, and what they care about to how much they talk about something will then influence how much companies pay attention to that and how much policymakers take up that issue. And so I think that, yes, you can do top down policy making from a government perspective, but you can also use words to kind of influence grassroots behavior so that people are prioritizing things that they should be prioritizing, but might not be prioritizing just because they don't know that they should be. So, for example, open source. I don't think that I've made open source something that families are talking about at the dinner table, but it is something that not as many people have written about because it was behind the scenes and no one was paying attention to it. But hopefully in writing papers about it and writing shorter form, and this is kind of why I like writing for venues like Lawfare in addition to writing very long papers, because hopefully then somebody who had never even thought about this concept before reads this and thinks about it and then brings it up with their friend like, hey, I read this interesting thing recently. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of why I've ended up in the position I am, which is an academic where I can do kind of both, write things for policymakers and write things for the general public.
Wow, I see. That was actually a very deep response. And so you talked a bit about how, well, from what I kind of understood, you feel like it's kind of a liaison between the public and policymakers. So do you ever think about how unique that position is? I mean, you are kind of crossing the bridges between people who are speaking in jargons and you're bringing information to people who might not understand all those jargons.
Yeah. It's funny right now, a piece that I'm writing with a couple of co-authors is about AI's translation problem, about how as we write policies for AI, we need to keep in mind that ultimately the person whose behavior we're trying to influence is the engineer that's building something. And that's a long process of translation of different kinds of jargon, from law to, the executive at a company, to the general counsel at the company, to the product team, to the senior engineer, to the 23-year-old that just got hired out of MIT that's being asked to build the thing. And all of them might be understanding the words we use in a slightly different way. So, but yes, that is, I think, why I really like this position, because an error-free, communication process is impossible. But I think that the more you do it, the more you understand, oh, I see where this misunderstanding happened. I'll keep that in mind for the future. And will make sure that when I try to communicate between engineers and lawyers, I phrase it in a different way to make sure that everyone understands what I mean more. And so I like the iterative kind of feedback loop process.
That is great to hear. And actually that leads me to my last question for you today. So my question is, if you had to give one best piece of advice to a high school student, what would it be?
Anyone who has ever spoken to me probably will laugh and could guess at what I was going to say, but it is that people should network. And I think that networking is a kind of gross word because it seems kind of sycophantic and fake, and I do understand why people feel that, but really what I mean by networking is exactly kind of what you're doing with this series, which is expose yourself to people who you find interesting, even if they're not directly in the field that you expect to go in. If there's something about what they've written or their background or anything about them. For example, I met someone who was a, academic by day and tattoo artist by night. And, I was like, let's grab a cup of coffee because I'm so curious how this happened in your life. And what I mean by that is build these organic relationships and don't be scared to cold email someone and humbly ask, like, I understand your schedule is incredibly demanding, but do you have 10 to 15 minutes for like a quick call? I'd love to kind of hear about X. And, kind of depending on who the person is, come in with a very specific question about their background, or ask them kind of for advice. But I think that the worst thing that could happen is somebody ignores their email or says they don't have time. And that's not too big of a deal. And so, and kind of every job I've gotten, every good piece of advice, every research idea that I've had that I think was good, all of that was kind of contributed to by people I spoke to and the network I built over time.
That is amazing to hear and very good advice, I think. And I totally agree. I feel like this is just kind of personal, but I feel like me building this channel was me going through processes of emailing people and then them not responding or telling me that they don't have time for me. So I totally understand and I totally agree.
Yeah, no, it's amazing work that you're doing. And it's also just a great skill you're kind of building in the long run. I'm sure that you've experienced after you get a few ignored emails or responses that they don't have time, it doesn't emotionally impact you anymore. You're just like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I'll just respond. There's an infinite number of interesting people out there to reach out to. So, if one person doesn't have time, there'll be 5 others that you can send an email to. And then I guess to follow up on that, also don't be scared to be persistent. I think that one thing that I've done is after 2 weeks, I'll follow up with the same person. Hey, I just wanted to circle back on my email. I wasn't sure if it got lost in your inbox, and totally understand if you still don't have time, but thought I'd see, whether, the next month is more open for you. Worst case, they ignore that one too.
Exactly. Well, that is a wrap. So thank you so much to Professor Chinmayi Sharma for your expert insights into AI and law today. I had a great time speaking with you, and I hope my viewers and listeners enjoyed this too, and I'll see you all next time.
Thank you so much.